How's everybody doing? Everybody watching us on Facebook and YouTube. Let me get to this, and we're going to continue this discussion on Facebook after the show. So back on March 10th, I think it was March 10th when the primary took place in Michigan. I did a broadcast that day. I went and voted, voted that morning, and went and did a broadcast that day. And one of the things I talked about is Asian Americans do vote, because there was an Asian American behind me voting, and I dispelled all that nonsense that people are circulating around that Asians don't vote. That's just false. Okay, one. Two, I dealt with the policies of Mike Bloomberg, Joe Biden, and Bernie Sanders. Okay, and how and a black agenda, how they would impact African Americans and a black agenda. Right. First of all, a black agenda is not what we wait on people to present to us. A black agenda is what we present to elected officials, is what we present to candidates. A black agenda comes out of an understanding of African history, African American history, our experiences, understanding policies, the impact policies have had on African Americans, how policies help create conditions. Movements come out of those conditions to fight against conditions. Policies are then put in place to address the movements that were created to address conditions. So you have a continuum. Okay, politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. This is what politics is. Politics impacts every aspect of our life, from the water we drink to the air we breathe to the food we eat. Okay, so I want to look at at these various policies from the candidates, and then also Joe Biden has expanded his policies, incorporating policies from Bernie Sanders as well as Senator Elizabeth Warren. Since the March 10th broadcast that I did, when we had the primary here in Michigan, we know, well, shortly before that, Mike Bloomberg dropped out of the race. He endorsed Joe Biden. You had a lot of people on social media say, well, Mike Bloomberg has a black agenda. He has the Greenwood Initiative. So we need to vote for Mike Bloomberg. Well, he dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden. Senator Elizabeth Warren dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden. So did Bernie Sanders. And then also President Barack Obama came out and endorsed Joe Biden as well. So the Root.com has probably the best analysis that I've seen of the various policies comparing the different candidates. This is from February 28th, 2020. Written by Michael Harriot, and I disagree with him on a number of different things, but this was a good article that he wrote. So what the Root did is they asked policy experts, legal scholars, and political pundits, all of whom were African American, to help them devise what's called a policy matrix. A policy matrix, and this policy matrix is used to grade each plan of the candidates, okay? And they grade each plan on a scale of 1 to 10. They have 10 categories. They look at economics, criminal justice, education, politics, comprehensiveness. How detailed is the candidate's plan? Does it contain specific proposals? They look at blind spots, or are there important areas that are not addressed? They look at feasibility, which is extremely important. They look at feasibility. What are the chances of the policies being enacted by legislation, executive action, or internal policy? Does the candidate have the political skill to make their plan come true? Because anybody can just promise you anything. Back during the 2016 election, Jill Stein was running for president, polling at somewhere between 2% to 4% national polls. I saw African Americans right here in Detroit passing out flyers and saying, you vote for Jill Stein, she's going to help us get reparations. They said, we're going to get Jill Stein to do an executive order to give us reparations. I said, have you ever read Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution? Because you do understand that the powers of the purse string belong to Congress. They can't do an executive order for reparations. No, that's not going to happen. That has to pass both chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Now, I'm still waiting for somebody to explain to me how you're going to get this passed in the Senate when One, you got to get past the unanimous consent rule. We saw that Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn blocked 3 election integrity bills in the Senate that would have protected the elections of both Democrats and Republicans. Blocked it based upon unanimous consent. Because to proceed to a debate or a vote, they had to have unanimous consent. She blocked 3 bills dealing with protecting the integrity of elections that Republicans run in. And then also, Moscow Mitch McConnell said reparations is dead on arrival in the U.S. Senate. He's Senate Majority Leader. He controls, no bill can come to the Senate floor for debate or discussion without his approval. He already said it's dead on arrival. Okay, that's a whole nother separate issue. I don't have time to get into that. Okay, that's a whole nother separate issue. But feasibility. Number 8, history. What is the candidate's history of dealing with African Americans? Has the candidate displayed a willingness to address issues of race and inequality? Number 9, intentionality. Do we believe them, or do they need more people? Can we objectively believe that the candidate will work for African Americans? Is he or she pandering, or do they really have the will to make this a priority? Number 10, impact. If implemented, what impact would these policies have? How would the plan affect the problems it attempts to address? Okay, so it's the way they approach this. I've never seen a publication. I haven't seen it really, I don't think, at all, but definitely haven't seen a publication do something like this. Okay, so let's look at this. So some of these bottom feeders I'm going to skip over. Inconsequential. They dealt with Mike Bloomberg. I'm only dealing with Mike Bloomberg because people said, oh, Mike Bloomberg has a black agenda, so we need to vote for Mike Bloomberg. Okay? So the highest score is 100. Mike Bloomberg got a 43. The Greenwood Initiative is Mike Bloomberg's plan for economic justice, but he also has a number of other ideas. So we know, so they break it down. They look at economics. He got an 8. Criminal justice, he got a 7. Bloomberg wants to invest in smarter policing, implicit bias training, and prison population reduction. He proposes an end to cash bail and concentrate on recidivism prevention. He wants to legalize marijuana, but slowly. His plan to fund a conviction integrity unit is nice. Education, so he got a 6 on education. Bloomberg takes a moderate but fair approach. He plans to focus on HBCU STEM graduates, investing in schools, and funding low-income areas. Politics, he gets a 6. Comprehensiveness, he got a 4. Bloomberg has a little bit for everyone. He tackles police brutality, college admissions, and economic justice, but just a little bit. Blind spots, he gets a 4. Feasibility, he got a 2 for feasibility. Bloomberg's plans lack a lot of detail. For instance, his goal on reporting police shootings is to, quote, press state and local agencies to report all incidents to the FBI's use of force data collection, end quote. Plus, he has no legislative experience or history of building a consensus. Most of his policies don't spell out how he will enact them. Okay, he never served in Congress. He was a mayor of New York, but he never served in House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, dealing with federal legislation. History, he gets a 2. Okay, we know about stop and frisk, most people. Intentionality, he got a 1. Impact, he got a 3. So he got a 43 out of 100. Bernie Sanders got a total score of 50 out of 100. Now, I like Bernie. Bernie's a nice guy. I may disagree with him on some things. I said from the beginning, whoever gets the nomination, Democratic nomination, that's who I'm voting for. Okay? So when we look at Bernie Sanders' policies, for economics, he got a 7. Sanders' plan for economic justice is very vague. It lists the most commonly known problem, the wealth gap, redlining, housing discrimination, and vows to fix them. But it doesn't say how he will do it. He seems to rely on his plan for income inequality to answer all questions. He does not support, and they stated he does not support reparations. Now, very quickly, Bernie Sanders has said before, and I was in the audience when he said this, he supports H.R. 40, what Bernie Sanders has said in the past is that he's against just giving cash payments in the form of reparations, meaning he's against reparations 100% being in the form of cash payments. Okay, well, I'm against that too, because if all black people got $1 million today, white people will have it all back this time next week, and it will not bring about the structural change in our community that we need to see. So I'm against reparations being in the form 100% of cash payments. Cash payments can be part of it, like the Black Freedmen Indian treaties of 1866. Cash payments were part of that, but they also got land, they got free taxes, free college tuition. Those are laws still in the books today for the Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians. Some of our ancestors were in those treaties and got compensation. That's how you get a Sarah Rector in Oklahoma, who became the richest Afro-American girl in the country in the early 1900s. Google Sarah Rector, R-E-C-T-O-R. Go to blackpast.org and search for Sarah Rector. All that ties into history. That ties into the Black Freedmen Indian treaties. It ties into the Dawes Allotment Act, the 1887, the Dawes Allotment Act. Okay, so that is a historical and legal example of some of our people getting some type of restitution. All right. So criminal justice, he gets a 5. Let me know how much time I have left, JT. Criminal justice, Bernie Sanders gets a 5. Sanders' criminal justice displays the same performative rhetoric. His details aren't revelatory, and he offers no solutions except to say that he will solve the problems. Back in, I think it was June or July of 2019 at Cobo Hall here in Detroit, Michigan, the NAACP had their national conference. They had the town hall meeting with the Democratic presidential candidates, and also Bill Weld, who's running for the Republican candidacy for Republicans. Bernie Sanders said then, when April Ryan interviewed him, part of the town hall, April Ryan was the moderator. He said then he supported HR 40, which is sponsored by Representative out of Texas, Representative Lee out of Texas, Barbara Lee out of Texas, I think it is. Sheila Jackson Lee, I'm sorry, Sheila Jackson Lee out of Texas. He said then he supports HR 40. Okay, so criminal justice, he gets a 5. Education, he gets a 4. Sanders promises to make college debt free for everyone who attends a 4-year college. He also plans to cancel student debt and give $1.3 billion to HBCUs and minority-serving institutions. Aside from child care, his platform has very little, if any, information on reducing disparities in K-12 education. For education, you got a 4. Now, it's important to note, as campaigns progress, a lot of times candidates do add to their platform, add to their policies, add more details to their policies. That is true in general. Okay, and we've also seen that Joe Biden has, since he's the presumptive nominee, he's adopted policies from Senator Elizabeth Warren as well as Bernie Sanders dealing with student debt forgiveness. Okay, thegrio.com has an article dealing with that. Okay, we're running out of time here on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation. We're going to continue this on my Facebook fan page, The African History Network. Listen to The African History Network show Sundays 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. right here on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, the Future Radio. I'm Michael Imhotep. Remember, right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. Stay tuned for Pastor Mo. We'll talk to you next week. Peace. Okay, so we're done on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation. We'll continue here on our social media platforms. How's everybody doing? Those just tuning in. It's Sunday, April 26, 2020. This is the African History Network show. We do 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, WFDF in Detroit. I do radio here in Detroit. Normally, I'm in the studios at 9:10 a.m. the Superstation. But because of coronavirus and Governor Gretchen Whitmer's stay-at-home order, they have us broadcasting from home. Okay, so we're going to continue here, and I have as long as I want to here because I'm on my own time. How's everybody doing? Everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook pages and YouTube. Invite your friends to tune in also. Okay. All right. The article is a really good article, really good analysis from theroot.com. And I've been critical of the Root in the past, and rightfully so. But I give, credit where credit is due as well. They did a good job with this. This is entitled Every Democratic Candidate's Black Agenda Ranked. This is from February 28th, 2020. It has not been updated since then. Every Democratic Candidate's Black Agenda Ranked. This is from February 28th, 2020 from TheRoot.com. Okay. Let's continue here. So we're looking at Bernie Sanders. Blind spots. Bernie Sanders gets a 5. Sanders doesn't have any egregious blind spots in his platform because it consists mostly of listing the problems and saying, I got this. Feasibility. He gets a 4 for feasibility. As with other platforms, without any specifics, it is hard to say if Bernie Sanders could pass these detail-free policies. As a legislator, he has not displayed much effectiveness in getting his proposals passed. And there was talk about that in the past. He doesn't have a history of getting a lot of his bills, sponsoring bills for one, and getting a lot of his bills passed too. Okay, he doesn't really have a good history of that. Well, I bet, he's a nice guy. I think he means well. One thing people have to understand about Bernie Sanders is that Bernie Sanders is from the state of Vermont. Vermont, the population of African Americans in Vermont is something like 4 or 5%. So traditionally, a lot of issues pertaining to African Americans, at least in his state, in general, he really didn't have to deal with a whole lot of that. Okay, just because of the population of African Americans in the state of Vermont. All right, and I've known about Bernie Sanders for years, even before he ran for president. I saw him in the documentaries Koch brothers Exposed and Alec Exposed. I think those are probably on YouTube. You can watch those. I would see him on MSNBC all the time, so I was familiar with him before he even ran the first time for president. Okay, all right. So let's continue here. All right, just a second. This is running slowly. How's everybody doing today? We've got, let's see here. We got Deborah and Latonya, Philip, Renee, Dennis, Shelmadine, Terry, just a few of the people watching on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. Okay. And let's see here. All right, let's continue. Okay, so for feasibility, he got a 4. Bernie Sanders. For history, he got a 6. Bernie Sanders voted for the '94 crime bill, but he's not happy about it. He has made some problematic statements about African Americans, but he also has a history of being on the right side of most civil rights issues. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr. and supported Jesse Jackson. We know also Jesse Jackson came out. So he supported Jesse Jackson when Jesse Jackson ran back in '88. I think it was either '84 or '88 or both. Jesse Jackson endorsed Bernie Sanders. Okay, that happened after this report came out. So intentionality, he got a 3. Here's where Bernie Sanders' problem lies. His black agenda is performative at best. It is devoid of the kind of specifics that he displays in his tax plans, his health care proposals, and his income inequality policies. And actually, they started out by saying that Bernie Sanders' plan for racial justice is only a small part of his agenda for black America. Okay, they said that. So intentionality. Okay. Here's where Bernie Sanders' problem lies. His black agenda is performative at best. It is devoid of the kind of specifics that he displays in his tax plans, his health care proposals, and his income inequality policies. In interviews and in practice, he seems, in interviews and in practice, he seems to regard issues of race as purely a class issue. And I've seen this before with interviews that he's done, things like this. He seems to view issues of race as purely a class issue. And while race is inextricably tied to economics and class, white supremacy is not a math problem. One has to be intentional about confronting it. All right, so for intentionality, he gets a 3. And then for impact, he got a 7. If Sanders' overall policies were enacted, low income and middle class black people would undoubtedly see an economic benefit. It is a plan that includes black people, but it is not for black people. So for impact, he got a 7. He got a 50 out of 100. Okay. Tom Steyer got a 62 out of 100. Tom Steyer's campaign didn't go anywhere. Okay. So, you know, he wasted all that money. And then, let's see, who is next? Tom Steyer got a 62. Pete Buttigieg got a 66. After the first two, after Iowa and New Hampshire, it's pretty much over for Pete Buttigieg. He got a 66. He had the Douglas plan. Joe Biden got a 70. Okay. Joe Biden, at the time of this reporting, February 28, 2020, Joe Biden does not have a separate plan that spells out his vision for black America. But here's what we found by examining his platform. Now, this was at the time, this was as of February 28th. I know he's added more to his platform. I don't know if he's spelled out a vision for black America, but I haven't had a chance to look at that since, let me try to pull this up right now. I haven't had a chance to look at this. And like I said before, as campaigns progress, oftentimes candidates do flesh out their policies and do add to their policies, okay? But based on the policies that he had as of February 28th, he got a 70. And a lot of his policies will benefit African Americans. Let's look at this. So for economics, he got a 7. Joe Biden specifically mentions redlining, housing discrimination, fair lending practices. He offers boilerplate solutions on ways to tackle the wage and income gap, but he does single out black maternal health and health disparities. He does not support reparations, as based upon this reporting here on February 28th. Now, in debates when reparations have come up, he sidestepped the issue in general. There was one article that I read, I think it was from Politico.com, around the time when he made the comments about the two white senators who were segregationists, and that whole thing was largely misreported by the media. I dealt with this on my show back in June and July, and if you go to my YouTube channel, I have the clips there, and I go through step by step, and I show you how mainstream media largely misrepresented the comments that Joe Biden made, and 99.9% of the time, especially on MSNBC, and I like MSNBC, but some of it is garbage. 99.9% of the time when mainstream media reported on him talking about these two senators, they didn't tell you these were two Democratic senators he was talking about. Okay, Senator James Eastland, who was senator of Mississippi. He was known as the mouth of the White South. And there's an article from, I think it was NBCnews.com had an article dealing with this. They show Senator James Eastland in his Senate office. And behind him, he has the Confederate battle flag. Okay? He had on a flagpole. He was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Senate Judiciary Committee was the committee that Joe Biden was on when he became a senator in 1973. If you want to get anything done on your committee, you have to go through the chairman. And then it was Senator Herman Talmadge of Georgia. So these were two segregationists who, this was basically after the party realignment took place, that in the foundation of the party realignment goes back to 1928, and when Herbert Hoover ran for president as a Republican, and they instituted the Lily White Movement of 1928. The Lily White Movement was a movement to push African American Republicans out of the Republican Party, ignore their issues, ignore their concerns, ignore the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, who became very powerful in the 1920s. This all deals with history. I've done an entire presentation, a 3-hour presentation, dealing with the history of why African Americans switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, and dealing with the Lily White Movement in 1928, all that stuff. Okay, so check that out. We have that available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. But there's a whole history behind this. So the majority of those Southern segregationist Democrats are going to leave the party and go to the Republican Party, like Strom Thurmond, who in 1948 ran for president as a Dixiecrat. The Dixiecrats were basically the Southern segregationist Democrats. Okay, and then you had like Northern liberals like Al Smith. And Al Smith ran against Herbert Hoover in 1928. Herbert Hoover wins the presidency. He only serves one term because Herbert Hoover mishandled the economic catastrophe known as the Great Depression, which set it up for Franklin Roosevelt to become president. Okay? And if you saw the broadcast I did this past Thursday, April 24th, I dealt with, one of the things I dealt with was 4.4 million people filed for unemployment, 26 million in 5 weeks. I also dealt with Donald Trump banning immigration for 60 days and how that's a red herring and how he's trying to use immigrants as a scapegoat. And I dealt with how Herbert Hoover tried to do the same thing back in 1931 when in the 1930s, starting with Herbert Hoover, 1.8 million Mexican Americans, well, 1.8 million Mexicans were deported back to Mexico. 60% of them were Mexican Americans, so they were U.S. citizens, and they were deported to Mexico. 60% of them were Mexican Americans, and Herbert Hoover and Republicans and a lot of white people were blaming Mexicans for taking jobs of white people during the Great Depression. It largely was not true. And when they deported them, it caused an even huger problem because it caused a lack of migrant farmers, and also those 1.8 million Mexicans were contributing to the economy. Okay? And they were largely doing jobs that white people didn't want to do. And so, and Herbert Hoover had a campaign called American Jobs for Real Americans. American Jobs for Real Americans, and they were trying to protect these jobs for white people. So they deported 1.8 million Mexicans back to America. 60% of them were born here, and they were U.S. citizens. And this is what Trump is trying to do with banning immigration, and he's trying to scapegoat immigrants. And he's saying when we want to protect these jobs for Americans when these companies start to hire people back, right? But you don't have a problem exploiting their labor at your golf courses and your hotel resorts. And the other thing is a lot of the vegetation, a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we consume are picked by migrant workers, many of them undocumented migrants. Many of them are documented immigrants. So, and then the about $20 billion that undocumented immigrants pay in taxes each year? That just don't talk about that. The whole way this conversation is being framed is backwards. The whole way this conversation is being framed is backwards. And what they don't want to tell you is white people ain't getting out there picking blueberries and strawberries and stuff. They're not doing this. They tried that back in 1968. It didn't work. In 1968, NPR, everybody read this article. I talked about this briefly when I did my broadcast Thursday. This deals with back in 1965 when they were trying to give these jobs to white people, and they went and got high school students to do these to pick vegetation during the summer, and it didn't work. NPR National Public Radio has this article, August 23rd, 2018, when the U.S. government tried to replace migrant farm workers with high schoolers. When the U.S. government tried to replace migrant farm workers with high schoolers, okay? They were called the A-Team, okay? And the A-Team, these were supposed to be athletes, high school students who were athletes, and I think college students also, who were going to work in the fields, and they were going to give these jobs to high school students, college students. That ain't work out too well, okay? Let me see here. The year was 1965. On Cinco de Mayo, newspapers across the country reported that Secretary of Labor W. Willard Wirtz, W-I-R-T-Z, wanted to recruit 20,000 high schoolers to replace the hundreds of thousands of Mexican agricultural workers who had labored in the United States under the so-called Bracero program, B-R-A-C-E-R-O program, which is a program to allow Mexicans to come here and work as migrant workers. Because see, another thing that farmers are saying is we can't find enough people to come pick these crops. That's a little known secret that people really don't want to talk about. That farmers are saying, look, we can't find enough people to come pick these crops. These crops are going to rot on the vines. So it started in World War II. The program was an agreement between the U.S. and Mexican governments that brought Mexican men to pick harvests across the U.S. It ended in 1964 after years of accusations by civil rights activists like Cesar Chavez that migrants suffered wage theft and terrible working and living conditions. That was true. That was true. Okay? It's also true white people ain't getting out doing this for the most part. But farmers complained in words that echo today's headlines because the farmers are complaining now. This is what Trump don't want to talk about. But farmers complained in words that echo today's headlines that Mexican laborers did the jobs that Americans didn't want to do. And that the end of the Bracero program meant that crops would rot in the fields. To understand these tensions between the U.S. and Mexico, you got to study U.S. Mexican history going back about 170 years. Even before the Mexican-American War of 1846-1848 was really over territory, and this dealt with U.S. expansion and U.S. really wanting all of North America for itself. And it ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848. And the U.S. ended up getting the land from Mexico that makes up California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and Wyoming. They got all of that at the end of the Mexican-American War. That's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Okay, then you go back and you study the fight between fight of the Alamo and U.S. Wanting the land that makes up Texas. And Texas won its independence in 1836. You study Vicente Guerrero, who became president of Mexico, and he was of African descent, a former slave. He becomes president about 1829. and abolishes slavery, okay? And there's a Southern Underground Railroad where you had somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 runaway slaves who end up running into Mexico from Texas, but also from other state slaveholding states like Georgia, things like this, Georgia, Mississippi. Read the article here because I don't have time to get deep into this. I did this Thursday, April 24th. Go watch that broadcast. The U.S. deported 1 million of its own citizens to Mexico during the Great Depression. That's from History.com. History.com, July 12, 2019. The U.S. deported 1 million of its own citizens to Mexico during the Great Depression. Okay, and then we look at the little-known Underground Railroad that ran south to Mexico. The little-known Underground Railroad that ran south to Mexico. That's from History.com as well. Researchers estimate 5,000 to 10,000 people escaped from bondage into Mexico, says Maria Hammock, who is writing her dissertation about this topic at the University of Texas at Austin. But she thinks the actual numbers are higher. Mexico abolished slavery in 1829 when Texas was still part of the country, prompting white slave-holding immigrants to fight for independence in the Texas Revolution. Once they formed the Republic of Texas in 1836, they made slavery legal again, and it continued to be legal when Texas joined the U.S. as a state in 1845. So you're going to have this Southern Underground Railroad, and because Vicente Guerrero was a former slave, he abolished slavery. He was the president of Mexico. Okay? This is a little-known African-American history fact. But it wasn't only enslaved people in Texas who found freedom in Mexico. Quote, I have found individuals who made it all the way from North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, Maria Hammock says. So read this article here. This gets deep into history that a lot of people don't even know exists. The little-known Underground Railroad that ran south to Mexico. It's 1836 that the Texas Rangers, who are now the state police, and they're famous, law enforcement officers in the state of Texas. The Texas Rangers started out as bounty hunters who formed in 1836, and they were hired by white slave owners to go into Mexico and capture runaway slaves and bring them back to slave owners in Texas. This is how the Texas Rangers got their start. Okay, and so we have that article. And then there was one from the Washington Post. President Herbert Hoover deported 1 million Mexican Americans for supposedly stealing jobs during the Great Depression. President Herbert Hoover deported 1 million Mexican Americans for supposedly stealing jobs during the Great Depression. So that's from August 13th, 2018 from the Washington Post. Okay, so check out that article. There's a whole deep history here that a lot of people don't know. Then you can read this book here, 10-Minute Guide to U.S. History from Encyclopedia Britannica. This gives a good, concise overview of U.S. history chronologically. 10-Minute U.S. Guide to U.S. History. And very quickly here, when we look at what precedes the Mexican-American War, we look at Manifest Destiny, page 64. They talk about Manifest Destiny, right? And in Donald Trump's 2020, in his State of the Union address, he talked about manifest destiny of space or something like that, outer space, something like that, right? So the term manifest destiny was created by John L. O'Sullivan, who's the editor of a magazine that served as an organ for the Democratic Party and of a partisan newspaper. And he first wrote of Manifest Destiny in 1845. So this is the year before the Mexican-American War begins. But at the time, he did not think the words were profound. Rather than being quote-unquote coined, the phrase was buried halfway through the third paragraph of a long essay in the July-August issue of the United States Magazine and Democratic Review on the necessity of annexing Texas and the inevitability of American expansion. John L. O'Sullivan was protesting European meddling in American affairs, especially by France and England, which he said were acting, quote, for the avowed object of thwarting our policy and hampering our power, limiting our greatness and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, end quote. So John L. O'Sullivan's observation was a complaint rather than a call for aggression, and he referred to demography rather than pugnacity as the solution to the perceived problem of European interference. But he was complaining about Europeans interfering in U.S. expansion to take over all of the territory of North America. Democrats took up Manifest Destiny as a slogan. The phrase frequently appeared in debates relating to the state of Oregon, or the territory of Oregon, sometimes as soaring rhetoric and other times as sarcastic derision. An example of the latter, on February 6, 1846, the New Hampshire Statesman and State Journal, a Whig newspaper. The Whig was a political party that existed like 1830s, 1840s. It existed before the Republican Party. The Republican Party was founded in 1854. You have the Whig Party, and then also 1830s, 1840s, you're going to have the American Nativist Party, which was also ostensibly known as the Know Nothing Party. And they were largely made up of poor white people who blamed immigrants for taking their jobs. Sounds a lot like Donald Trump supporters. They were called the Know Nothing Party, ostensibly known as the Know Nothing Party, but they were known as the American Party or the American Nativist Party. Okay, so they're in the 1830s, 1840s. So a Whig newspaper described, quote, some windy orator in the House of Representatives as pouring for his manifest destiny. Okay, so check out this book, and it deals with also a history of expansion as well. Okay, this is a really good book that gives a good, concise overview of U.S. history. I got this at Sam's Club, $7.78. This is from Encyclopedia Britannica, 10-minute guide to U.S. history. So, when we look at this, and to understand these policies and all this, and even to put together the Black Agenda, you have to have a good understanding of history and the impact that policies have had on African Americans. Okay, so we look at Joe Biden, economics, he got a 7. Criminal justice, he got a 7. Again, Joe Biden tackles most of criminal justice issues that are prevalent in America. One of the unique areas that he confronts is the criminalization of girls, foster children, and abused children. He also puts effort into violence against women and reintegrating the formerly incarcerated. Criminal justice, he got a 7. Education, he got a 6. And let me see. There's a comprehensive. Let's talk about the crime bill. Okay, I'm gonna give you some information here on the crime bill. Because I hear a whole lot of people talking about it, and I can tell they don't understand history once again. Go to bjs.gov, Bureau of Justice Statistics, and look at U.S. prison populations from 1970 to 1993. The U.S. prison population quadruples from 1970 to 1993. It goes from about 300,000 to about 1.3 million in 1993. This is before the crime bill was signed September 13th, 1994. I hear a lot of people saying that the crime bill created mass incarceration, things like that. No, it did not. The U.S. prison population quadruples from 1970 to 1993. You have to go back and study Richard Nixon's war on drugs. Richard Nixon declared his war on, President Richard Nixon declared his war on drugs June 17th, 1971. Okay? He ran for president in 1968. He ran on the platform of law and order. Law and order means protect white people and lock up African Americans. Richard Nixon ran as a backlash to the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Executive Order 11246 of 1965, which we call affirmative action, September 1965, which we call affirmative action. He runs as a backlash of all this. He runs as a backlash to the rebellions taking place across the country. 1967 Detroit Rebellion and Newark, New Jersey Rebellion, things like this. And we know 1967 alone, there were 159 violent uprisings in this country. 159 violent uprisings in 1967 alone. USA Today has a good article, deals with the Newark, New Jersey rebellion of 67. They talk about the long hot summer of 1967. Read that article, okay? Nixon runs as a backlash to all of that. In the early 1970s, there's a changing mood in this country regarding drug usage, drug sellers, and how to deal with them. And there's a move away from prescribing. There's a move away from prescribing treatment for them to moving towards taking a hard line, cracking down on them, locking them up. You have movies in the early 1970s like The French Connection. There's a changing mood in the country, okay? So you have Nixon that declares his war on drugs in front of the U.S. Congress, demanding more funding, increase in funding for the war on drugs. It's June 17, 1971. 1973, you have Governor Nelson D. Rockefeller, of the governor of New York at the time. And he wants to run for president. He originally took a soft line to people who use drugs and prescribed treatment. But because he wants to run for president and there's a changing mood in the country, this is 73, 74, he changes his position and he institutes the Rockefeller drug laws in the state of New York, which gives long, harsh sentences for low-level nonviolent drug offenders. He institutes mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums were in the 94 crime bill. But they go back to 20 years before then with Governor Nelson D. Rockefeller in the state of New York. In the 1970s, states started passing longer, harsher sentences for criminals. This didn't start in 94. This goes back to the 1970s. It goes to the 1970s, continues in the 1980s, continues into the early 90s. States are already doing this. 94 crime bill is not state law, it's federal law. About 87% of the people who go to prison once the crime bill takes effect and signed into law, about 87% of the people go under state law, not federal law. States had already started passing longer, harsher sentences. They're going to continue to do this. When you go to bjs.gov and you look at the U.S. prison populations, go back to 1970. And you go into the 80s and go into the 90s and go even before the crime bill, because violent crimes peak nationwide in 1992. Violent crimes peak nationwide in 1992. So you're going to see the U.S. prison population going like this. Before the crime bill is signed, you're going to see the U.S. prison population going like this, because the U.S. prison population quadruples from 1970 to 1993. Okay? So I'm not saying the crime bill was good. In all actuality, it was mixed when you actually look at what was in it. A lot of people haven't looked at what was in it. They just see 3 strikes and you're out. They haven't looked at this thing holistically and understanding the basically 25, 24, 25 years of history prior to it being signed into law. So you have to look at, you can't just look at something like this at one point in time when it was signed into law. You have to look at the history prior to that, because we have to understand all this chronologically. Okay, so the article from NPR.org, and I'm going to give you information dealing with what was actually in the crime bill also. The article from NPR.org is, let's see, what's the name of that one? Rockefeller Drug Laws. Let's bring this up here. All right, just a second. This will come up here. This deals with the history of the Rockefeller drug laws. Also, the crime bill did. Now, Joe Biden wrote the majority of the crime bill. He did not write all of the crime bill. He wrote the majority of the crime bill. It allocated about $9.8 billion for states to build more prisons if they adhere to like certain rules, certain laws. Okay, 28 states out of 50 took advantage of that. All 50 states didn't do that. It was 28 states out of 50. The Brennan Center for Justice has information dealing with this. It was 28 states out of 50. As you read this article from NPR.org, the drug laws that changed how we punish. The drug laws that changed how we punish. This deals with the history of the Rockefeller drug laws. And this goes back to 1973 and 1974. And this is where mandatory minimums come from, okay, that were put into the 94 crime bill. Keep in mind, 87% of the people who went to prison during the time, once the crime bill became law, 87% of the people who went to prison went under state law, not federal law. The crime bill was federal law. Also, it's important to note, so you had African American big city mayors who were advocating for the crime bill. Because once again, you have to go back and study context and what was taking place at that time. Violent crime across the country was buck wild. Like I said, violent crime, when you go, I went to bjs.gov and I looked at the crime statistics. Violent crimes peaked in 1992. You had constituents, you had African Americans, white people, Hispanics, putting pressure on big city mayors and police chiefs to do something about this crime. So when you have big city mayors who were supporting the crime bill, it wasn't because they just want to just lock a whole lot of black people up. It's because they're trying to address this issue in their communities. This is what this was. Now the crime bill went too far. But at the same time, the prison population was really already out of hand by then. I mean, prison population quadruples from 300,000 to about 1.3 million in about 25 years, from 1970 to 1993, about 23 years. Okay, so this thing is already out of control. But the crime bill, it got worse with the crime bill, but it didn't start with it. Okay, so read this article here. We'll post this link here. This is from NPR.org. Read that article. And then there's one from NJ. I'll give you two other ones. One is from NJ. What is it? The computer's freezing up here. It's one that deals with. It's a 94 crime bill fact sheet, and it shows everything that was in the crime bill. That's one. That's one. The other is a good article from Vox.com, Vox.com. The Clinton-backed 1994 crime law had many flaws, but it did not create mass incarceration, which is true. It did not. The Clinton-backed 1994 crime law had many flaws, but it did not create mass incarceration. That's by German Lopez. That is from April 8th, 2016 for Vox.com, VOX.com. Check that out. All right. Let's continue here. Also, you can search online because at I think it's Congress.gov. I got it. The full crime bill is like 356 pages, and I've gone through and started reading some of it. You can read the full 1994 crime bill to see exactly what it was as well. Okay, but when we deal with all this, we have to understand context and what was going on at that time. The other thing is that a lot of people don't know is that 53% of gang-related murders between 1980 and 2008. 53% of gang-related murders from 1980 to 2008 were committed by white people. Okay? A lot of people don't want to talk about this. Because, see, the way gang-related murders were covered by the 6 o'clock news and 11 o'clock news, they made it just a black or Hispanic thing. It was taking place in our communities, but it was buck wild in the white communities. So you had white constituents and white parents also crying out about the crime in their communities. It was white people, Hispanics, African Americans, putting pressure on their elected officials to do something about the crime. 56% of the victims of gang-related murders were white people. 53% of the people who committed gang-related murders were white people, because there was a lot of white gangs. But a lot of the white gangs were not talked about on the 6 o'clock news. It was presented as a black and Hispanic thing. But gang violence was big in white communities. Okay? So there was an article I found out about this. I heard about this before, but there was a good article from AtlantaBlackStar.com that dealt with 9 facts about white-on-white crime and how news outlets conceal it, something to that effect. Okay? It's from AtlantaBlackStar.com. And fact number 7 dealt with white gang violence. So that came from a Bureau of Justice Statistics study. It's a 36-page study. I went and read the study. Page 12, table number 7, deals with gang-related murders. And it talks about how the majority of them were committed by white people. Okay? So there's a whole backstory to all of this that's not really talked about. All right. So let's continue here. All right, let's continue. So you have feasibility. Let me see, who would he vote for? Joe Biden. Okay, you got a score of 70, and so criminal justice, he tackles most of the criminal justice issues that are prevalent in America. He has a criminal justice reform program. He has come out and talked about how the 94 crime bill went too far also. BusinessInsider.com has an article dealing with that as well. So one of the unique areas that he confronts is the criminalization of girls, foster children, and abused children. He also puts effort into violence against women and reintegrating the formerly incarcerated. Now, it's also important to note, and you've heard me talk about this before, I may be one of the few people to talk about it. The U.S. prison population dropped to the lowest point in 20 years under President Obama, December 2015. U.S. prison population dropped to its lowest point in 20 years in December 2015. And there was an article from Newsweek.com that talks about this. And there was a report from the Department of Justice in December 2016 that showed this. Okay, and under the Obama administration, we see that the U.S. prison population drops each year under the Obama administration because the war on drugs was largely winding down under the Obama administration. Okay, and this is something a lot of people don't know. The percentage of African Americans in prison dropped from 40% down to 34% under the Obama administration. All of this, okay, and a lot of this stuff is being reversed under Trump. People talk about First Step Act, but all these other policies from Trump dealing with criminal justice are not beneficial to African Americans. A lot of those under President Obama were, and we saw that it was Trump's first Attorney General, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, who reversed the 2013 initiative from Attorney General Eric Holder called Smart on Crime. And Smart on Crime dealt with backing off of charging low-level nonviolent drug offenders with the longest, harshest sentences. Okay, this was an initiative from the Department of Justice. And we also saw that a lot of states and state attorney generals and things like this backed off of, we saw reforms at various state levels, okay, which can, and a lot of states backed off of charging low-level nonviolent drug offenders with the longest, harshest sentences, etc. Okay, and so all this contributed to a decline in the U.S. prison population under President Obama. All right. So when we look at, so criminal justice, Biden gets a 7. Education, he gets a 6. Biden tackles K through 12 funding, HBCU funding, and school inequality. He has one of the few campaigns that tie redlining and zip codes to education inequality. He has one of the few campaigns that ties redlining and zip codes to education inequality. He also focuses on putting black teachers in schools, which we know is huge. When you have qualified black teachers in schools teaching African American children, that helps boost their achievement and also boost the percentages of them that go to college as well. His idea to offer a path from community colleges to HBCUs is innovative. So for education, he gets a score of 6. For politics, he gets a score of 5. The Biden campaign does not really address voting rights except to say that he plans to use the Department of Justice on violators. He also wants to incentivize states to restore voting rights to felons. Okay. Now, once again, I think he's going to expand a lot of these policies. In general, as campaigns progress, they usually flesh out and add to their policies. Okay, for comprehensiveness, he gets a 9. Here's where Biden has the advantage. In almost every area, he can point to actual legislation and policy that he has passed or enacted during the Obama administration. The only thing that hurts Biden is that he can point to specific actions and legislative plans from his tenure as vice president, which makes his more aspirational plans look sparse when he doesn't provide specifics. Also, you've heard me talk about this before. It's important for everybody to read this. Read this document here. Progress of the African American community during the Obama administration. This is at whitehouse.gov. You don't have to believe me. You can go read this yourself. Progress of the African American community during the Obama administration. This is at whitehouse.gov. This goes through category by category, and shows how the policies from the Obama administration positively impacted the African American community. A lot of people don't want to talk about this because most of them don't know about this. A lot of these policies are either under attack by Trump or they have been reversed by Trump or severely weakened. Okay? When Donald Trump asked, what the hell do you have to lose? Our response should have been everything. But most people don't know this exists. Okay? And you hear me talk about the Affordable Health Care Act. The Affordable Health Care Act gave health care to 3 million non-elderly African Americans who did not already have health care. Okay, and today you have less people you have less African Americans today who have health care than when President Obama left office. So this is not about Democrat or Republican, it's about policies that benefit African Americans. All right, let's continue here. So comprehensiveness, he gets a score of 9. Blind spots, he gets a score of 7. Biden does not specifically address gerrymandering or voting security. He also doesn't mention white supremacist violence. Overall, his plan has few holes. For feasibility, he gets a 10. Joe Biden has more legislative and executive experience than almost any politician in history. He knows how to compromise and get laws passed. Okay? So feasibility, he gets a 10. He understands how to negotiate with the Senate. For history, he gets a 5. Aside from his brief war, aside for dragging Anita Hill through the mud, etc., writing a crime bill that disproportionately incarcerated black men. Once again, like I said, we really need to go and study the crime bill, and very few people talk about the fact that about 87% of the people who went to prison once the crime bill was passed, they went under state law. States had already started passing longer, harsher sentences in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. So when we talk about the crime bill, all of that has to be put in perspective as well. There were some bad things in the crime bill. 3 strikes and you're out, the death penalty. I'm against the death penalty, period. I'm totally against the death penalty because it's disproportionately used against African Americans. But a lot of times when we talk about the crime bill, is not put into proper context and is not dealt with accurately. So we have to really deal with it accurately. So history, he gets a 5. It says, to be fair, he has a good voting record on a lot of civil rights legislation, affirmative action, and most progressive race-based policies. For intentionality, he gets an 8. Biden worked for a black boss as a VP. He was surrounded by African Americans who were smarter than him, like Susan Rice, Michelle Obama, Eric Holder, Jay Johnson, who was Homeland Security Director. This might not seem like much, but 8 years listening to African Americans is something few white people have ever done. Okay. Intentionality, he gets an 8. For impact, he gets a 6. Biden's policies are progressive but not groundbreaking. He wants to fix the inequalities through conventional means and left-center legislation. However, if enacted, they would make a significant impact. And this is what people have to understand. A black agenda is good to have. But black agenda is not what we wait on people to give to us. That's what we present to the candidates. That gives us a measuring stick to measure the candidates by, measure their policies by, and see how the policies of candidates measure up to our issues, our concerns. Okay? But a policy does not have to say black or African American to benefit you, and does not have to say black or African American to disproportionately positively benefit you either. This is what we have to understand. For instance, in July of 2019, Democrats in the House of Representatives passed a bill to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour, where it currently is right now, to $15 an hour by the year 2025. that will disproportionately positively impact African Americans, especially African American women, who on average make 61 cents for every dollar that the average white male makes. And this is what Black Women's Equal Pay Day is all about. And then we know in the state of Louisiana, African American women make 47 cents for every dollar that the average white male makes. In general, it takes the average African American woman 20 months to make the same amount of money that the average white male makes in 12 months. African American men make about 79, 80 cents on the dollar the average white male makes. When you go, now you're not going to get rich $15 an hour, but $15 an hour is a floor, not a ceiling. But it will lift millions of African Americans out of poverty if that bill is enacted. It passed the House of Representatives. It's being blocked in the Senate by Moscow Mitch McConnell and Republicans in the Senate. Read this article from blackenterprise.com. Black women lose out over $1 million in their careers thanks to the wage gap. Black women lose out over $1 million in their careers thanks to the wage gap. And when we look at the average African American woman, over a 40-year working career from age 18 to like about age 60, the average African American woman will lose out on $946,120 over a 40-year career if she continues to make 61 cents on the dollar that every white man earns due to the wage gap. Analysis by the National Women's Law Center shows. Read this article. This is deep. This impacts African American communities, our families, African American women, our families, African American men. All of this is negatively impacted by this. Okay, and also the Paycheck Fairness Act would help this a lot. The Paycheck Fairness Act needs to be passed by the U.S. Senate. It's already passed the House of Representatives. Read this article from blackenterprise.com. Now, this deals with how laws and policies impact the economic conditions of African Americans. Okay, this deals with how laws and policies impact the economic conditions of African Americans. Black women lose out over $1 million in their careers thanks to the wage gap. Okay, yeah, check out that article. And then also there's one from Forbes.com on Black Women's Equal Pay Day. Here's how women are fighting to close the gap. This is from August 22nd, 2019 on Black Women's Equal Pay Day. Here's how women are fighting to close the gap. And Black Women's Equal Pay Day is it fell on August 22nd. It fell on August 22nd, 2019. Okay, so check out those articles. I've done broadcasts in the past dealing with all of this. All right, so as we wrap this up, now Elizabeth, visit JoeBiden.com. Look at his policies. He's expanded his policies, adopted policies from Bernie Sanders as well, at dealing with student loan forgiveness up to $100,000, and also from Elizabeth Warren. There's an article from thegrio.com that deals with this. Joe Biden adopting these policies. Senator Elizabeth Warren got a 79. Senator Elizabeth Warren got a 79 out of 100. She got the highest. Okay, check out this article here from TheRoot.com. You can read it in its entirety. February 28, 2020. Every Democratic candidate's Black agenda ranked. Every Democratic candidate's Black agenda ranked. Okay, and visit my website. I have my lectures there dealing with 6 principles of political self-defense, understanding how laws and policies impact the economic conditions of African Americans. And what's most important is whose policies are most beneficial for African Americans, whose policies will do the least amount of harm, who can create an environment for us to push our agenda the farthest and get the most accomplished. Okay? Who can create an environment for us to push our agenda the farthest and get the most accomplished, whose policies are most realistic. All right? This all deals with understanding principles of political self-defense. We must understand law and history. The foundation is the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution is the foundation for law in this country. We don't understand the U.S. Constitution. We don't understand history. We don't understand law. So that's why we have to really study all of this, and this will help formulate a Black agenda, and this will help understand how these policies impact us on a daily basis and impact our economics as well. Okay, so you'll hear me talk about this more in the upcoming broadcasts. We have to get out of here. Remember, the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it's correct wrong behavior. You can donate to the African History Network, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, also through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show, paypal.me/the AHN Show, or at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. All of my DVD lectures are at our website as well. We have bundle packs there, like the Black Migration 1619 to 2019 bundle pack, which includes 6 principles of political self-defense. Right now, it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. For Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.